I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to be talking about unintended consequences. Unintended consequences infect our lives, frequently rearing their heads in the outcomes of our actions. We tend to recall the ones that negatively affect us, though we might not realize that they have surfaced at all if their effects were not harmful. However, when adversely affected, the prudent may strive to consider them as lessons learned, incorporating these hard-earned lessons consciously or unconsciously into their future actions. They try to understand how these unintended consequences wormed into their plans, and then modify future plans to avoid the possibility of their arising. The fear of negative unintended consequences inspires in us caution to tread carefully, though by its nature, even the modifications that we incorporate from previous lessons bring in themselves a cost and possibly further unanticipated and hence unintended consequences. By its very nature as a lack of intention on our part which nonetheless brings about unanticipated results and outcomes, unintended consequences are only known ex post after the event. In that way, they seem almost unavoidable, though by their lack of necessity, they are not necessarily inevitable. This paper aims to examine the nature of the phenomena of unintended consequences. To convince the reader of the importance of what appears to be a pervasive and yet understudied phenomenon, the essay starts by examining examples of unintended consequences before analysing its meaning, why and how it arises. Given its nature of appearing even in our best laid plans, the paper will consider who, if anyone, is responsible. It concludes with suggestions on how to live with what appears to be inescapable and unintended consequences. Why are unintended consequences interesting? Action leads to consequences, and hence the place to look for unintended consequences is after the completion of actions. Actions are carried out with a certain intent. We raise the fork to our mouths to eat. We eat to satisfy our hunger, or if we have no hunger, we might eat out of habit. We walk to get to our destination. If our walking was just exercising without a destination in mind, then our intention was to keep fit. What we do not intend while eating is to choke to death on the food, or while walking, to be knocked down by a car. However, these calamities do occur, and when they do, these unintended consequences tend to give us pain and regret, though we might not be to blame since we lacked intent. We have become familiar with the destructive effects of climate change. Weather-related disasters have increased in frequency and severity. Flood-prone areas are experiencing floods not only more often but with greater force, while arid regions have the opposite problem, with more frequent and intense droughts. Animal and plant species have in the meantime gone extinct due to these climate effects. The stoicer among us may acknowledge that we reap the seeds we have sown in our release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But when Colonel Edwin Drake first struck oil on an industrial scale in 1859, could he have anticipated the deleterious effects of pollution and global warming felt by humankind over 100 years later? If he had known, would he have ceased and desisted from oil well drilling, concealing his engineering designs from the world? If he did, he would literally have kept us in the dark, since we would not have the kind of electrical lighting we have today. We would still be going around on horses, since the advent of the motor car would have been nigh impossible without a source of portable fuel such as petroleum. Our societies would be rather differently structured, since the Industrial Revolution would not have occurred, at least in the form that it did happen, and with it the advent of capitalism. For all the now recognized harm of fossil fuels, they also changed the world in some good ways. Even climate change with its destructive force comes with some benefits. Some of these include the opening of mineral-rich lands and navigable sea lanes in the Arctic region. Warmer temperatures may make regions previously unsuitable for winemaking, such as South England, the new centers of viticulture, while destroying the renowned vineyards of Bordeaux and Champagne. For Drake, climate change was no doubt not on his mind, since it was a concept formulated years after his discovery. It is an unintended consequence, though the same cannot be said of the planners who are salivating over the profits from Arctic resources and shipping, or the prospective wine growers in the UK. These potential outcomes are now foreseen, though it may seem unjustified to project onto their plans any intentions to exacerbate climate change for their private benefit. Besides, Drake as an individual is not to be blamed, since it is not the small-scale use of petroleum that is leading to climate change. It is the widespread use of it by individuals and industry that is causing so much pollution such that the planet cannot through its natural processes absorb the CO2 and other pollutants that is leading to climate change. However, more local or individualized set of actions can indeed set off large-scale ramifications. The biblical story of Adam and Eve is a prime instance, with the punishment for their original sin afflicting all of humankind, including those yet to be born. Their innocent frolic in the Garden of Eden was brought to an abrupt end when they partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were tempted by the devil, incarnate in the form of a serpent, who promised them that they would be like God, knowing good and evil, though they had been previously warned by their Creator that they would surely die if they did partake. Drawing on Soren Kierkegaard's interpretation of the event, we first have to understand that the couple were epistemically innocent. Since they had yet to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they did not know the distinction between good and evil and what these concepts meant. They were created to be immortal and hence did not understand what was meant by death, though as Kierkegaard pointed out, they might have been able to intuit from God's tone that it was something threatening. Had they known the consequences, really understood what would happen should they have eaten the forbidden fruit, would they have eaten it nonetheless? Would they have done it if they knew they would be cast out of paradise, that they would have to toil, suffer pain and death, and not just for themselves but for all generations which came from and after them? The biblical story must be the first instance of a paradox ever if we accept its origin as pre-antiquity. Adam and Eve were innocent of the knowledge of good and evil, and yet for them to fully comprehend the decision they faced, they had to have such knowledge, since otherwise they could not understand what the consequences of disobedience could possibly even mean. How then could they even make a proper decision? Regardless of whether you accept the authenticity of the biblical account, the reader would be able to appreciate it as a paradigmatic example of how innocence can lead to unintended consequences. Adam and Eve were not intent on bringing suffering into the world. They simply were ignorant of what death, good and evil might mean. That is, an ignorance of information in their current time that could aid their decision-making. Certainly, they were also ignorant of the unintended consequences brought about by their actions, but that is an ignorance of the future which is characteristic of all unintended consequences. If they were aware, sincere and truly cognizant of the meaning of death and evil, one would expect that they would have refrained. This refraining is of course a counterfactual, a speculation on what could have happened if they had acted otherwise than they actually did. As with the logic of counterfactual conditioners, nothing truthful can be said about the consequent arising from what, as antecedent, did not in fact take place. Fast forward to the 20th century where Albert Einstein worked out his theory of relativity. Did he foresee that its famed equation, E=mc², could be used to create weapons of mass destruction? If he did foresee it, did he intend for his theories to be used in such a way? Is he innocent, or does he have some responsibility for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and possibly the end of the human race should a full-blown nuclear war take place in the future? More generally, are scientists like Einstein, inventors, discoverers, innovators like Drake and entrepreneurs responsible for the unintended consequences of their actions? Even if we are willing to indemnify the scientists, engineers and technologists who merely came up with foundational theories that have dire unintended consequences, how about those who fully understood the consequences? J. Robert Oppenheimer, the head of the Manhattan Project, related his thoughts on viewing the first detonation of a nuclear weapon in 1945. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," words he took from Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita, but would henceforth be connected with him as the father of the atomic bomb. The destructive force of nuclear bombs is not an unintended consequence. Death and destruction is clearly intended, as Oppenheimer admits in his quote. With intention comes responsibility, but what if there was a lack of intention? Einstein's equation, published in 1905, explains the release of energy from matter such as the way it occurs in a death-bringing nuclear bomb and a peaceful energy-generating nuclear reactor. The same knife can be used to slice and dice life-giving food or to take away life. Einstein said, "I do not consider myself the father of the release of atomic energy. My part in it was quite indirect." He claims that his only act contributing to the production of nuclear weapons was his letter to President Roosevelt in 1939, where he warned that it was better for the United States to develop the technology before Nazi Germany did. He later expressed regret for this letter since Germany did not manage to develop nuclear bombs. Does history indemnify him? If he only knew of the unintended consequences of his theory, would he have burned his papers that formulated relativity? Even if he did destroy them and stopped working in physics, would someone else at some later point of time have thought up such a theory leading to the weaponization of the atom anyway? This question relates to the philosophy of determinism. The hard variety of determinism involves going back to the initial conditions of the universe, which set off a causal, unstoppable chain of events. If we are able to analyze everything right down to the subatomic level with some kind of supercomputer, we will be able to work out all that will happen. There will be, however, a rather limited value in doing so since all of it will be inevitable anyway. According to hard determinism, Einstein, Oppenheimer, Drake, Adam and Eve are all just actors in a cosmic plot where they could not have done otherwise than what they did due to the subatomic interactions prior to their actions, leading them and us to where we currently are and determining what we will do next. The soft variety of determinism is akin to Karl Marx's economic determinism, where it is simply a matter of time when one economic system overtook the prior, regardless of who the actors are. Analogous to Marx's economic determinism would be how, even if Einstein did not exist, someone else would simply have discovered relativity but somewhat later. According to Marx, societies in general pass deterministically through 5 different stages of societal development: primitive communal society, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and finally communism. While this has not come to pass in most societies to date, a Marxist still believes that it is only a matter of time, despite Marx's other failed predictions, such as how the first proletariat revolution would happen in an advanced industrialized economy such as Great Britain. One may argue that many of his predictions did not pan out precisely because they served as a warning which then modified the course of actual history. We may even go so far as to claim that this is an unintended consequence, or more convolutedly argue that this perhaps was after all his intention. Marx's writing do not borne out this suggestion, since according to him, the capitalists are themselves alienated from their work and are quite unable to help themselves, causing the inevitable chain of events as predicted by him. To channel Friedrich Nietzsche, it will be like asking a bird of prey not to hunt. Joseph Stalin, an adherent of Marxism while predating the coining of the term unintended consequences, explains the concept succinctly in his writing. When improving one instrument of production or another, men do not realize, do not understand, or stop to reflect what social results these improvements will lead to, but only think of their everyday interests, of lightening their labor and of securing some direct and tangible advantage for themselves. When gradually and gropingly, certain members of primitive communal society passed from the use of stone tools to the use of iron tools, they of course did not know and did not stop to reflect what social results this innovation would lead to. They did not understand or realize that the change to metal tools meant a revolution in production, that it would in the long run lead to the slave system. They simply wanted to lighten their labor and secure an immediate and tangible advantage. Their conscious activity was confined within the narrow bounds of this everyday personal interest. Following this logic of people's disinterest in long-run outcomes and their fixation on short-term advantage, Stalin went on to use the concept of unintended consequences to explain how the advent of industrialization would as an unintended consequence lead to the proletariat revolution as an unintended side effect of the massing of labor in cities and their exploitation, which caused the workers to develop a class consciousness. Not all unintended consequences are bad. This unintended consequence of the rising up and seizing of power by the workers as predicted by Marx is a positive outcome of the suffering of the workers. It is simply a progression of history in its inevitable march, what he regards as the dialectical movement of historical materialism. Another example of positive unintended consequences is the concept of the invisible hand in classical microeconomics. According to the theory, each person or entity as an economic agent simply has to pursue their own self-interest selfishly, and it will result in a good though unintended consequence of an efficient market. The term is coined by Adam Smith, who in the Theory of Moral Sentiments writes about a proud and unfeeling landlord who has large fields. The harvest from such vast lands is too much to be consumed by him alone. His workers enjoy a share of the produce of his lands through his employment of them, for example to upkeep the palace of their landlord. This trickle-down effect is not due to the generosity or kindness of the possibly rapacious landlord, but simply an unintended consequence which occurs out of the landlord's pursuit of his own self-interest. He does need workers to till his fields and servants to maintain his home. Likewise, the rich industrialists benefit thousands of people by providing them employment, though his intent was to enrich himself through their labor. Smith elaborates, "They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species." What are intentions? Sociologist Robert K. Merton is credited with the first explications of the term unintended consequences in 1936. The exact term he used is the unanticipated consequence of pervasive social action, which is also the title of his article. Indeed, his article captures the meaning of unintended consequences, outcomes of an intended or purposive action that are unanticipated. I shall further parse the two parts of the term unintended consequences, examining what is meant by intention and what consequences are being referred to. What can have intentions? While animals have intentions potentially leading to unintended consequences, such as a monkey putting its head into a cookie jar for a delicious snack only to get unintentionally stuck, the focus of this paper is on human intentions and actions. Some of the paper's conclusions will apply to animals, since human beings are, after all, animals. What is an intention? An intention is what a subject consciously cognizes as an aim when making not just any action but purposeful actions directed at an objective. Merton suggests that the objective need not be clear-cut or explicit since our aims may be hazy. He also does not assume that the action has to be rational. The object of the subject's action is assumed to be passive or reactive to the action, though the subject's anticipation of the object's reaction may influence the subject's choice of action. For instance, Jim anticipates that his wife Cynthia is happy to receive flowers. With the intention of making her happy, he brings flowers, though unbeknownst to him, she hates flowers as gifts, since she feels it is a waste of money. However, she recognizes his good intention. Not wishing to upset him, she acts as if she is happy, which leads to a continuous stream of flowers as gifts from Jim over the years, even though she is suffering inside. There is a shared intentionality, such that the subject's intention is conditioned on the intention of the object and vice versa. This certainly can be a source of unintended consequences, since both parties have good intentions, but it finally leads to their divorce when she tells him the truth. Such recursive intentionality belongs to human beings. If the object was an inanimate object or plant, the intention would then be on the side of the human subject alone. For instance, George has a plant. He intends to water the plant to keep it alive. However, the plant is a cactus, and his frequent watering causes it instead to die. The intent was to keep the plant alive, and the outcome was the opposite of the intention, the death of the plant. However, unintended consequences need not be opposite to the intent. They can be something completely unrelated. Continuing with the plant watering example, the plant one day becomes sentient due to all the water and love showered upon it and starts talking to George. This belongs to the class of unintended consequences that are not only unintended but also unforeseen. The death of the plant from overwatering belongs to the group of foreseen but unintended consequences. Every living thing dies, and so George arguably would have foreseen the plant's death. He is a novice at plant keeping and sufficiently self-aware to know that his efforts may be futile since he may care for the plant incorrectly. Given his inexperience, he modestly rated the chance of the plant's survival at 50%. Probabilities have a role to play in the foreseen but unintended consequence. Another kind of foreseen but unintended consequence is when an object is misused. That is, it is used in a way that it is not designed for. For instance, a candlestick is used to hold a candle, but it can and has been used as a murder weapon, at least in murder stories. The inventor of the candlestick probably did not invent it to be used as a murder weapon, though he might have noticed that the half of a brass candlestick might be enough to kill if swung violently, hence making such a consequence foreseen but unintended. The foreseen and intended consequence is the normal case of an action, where we make an action with an intention. For example, I kick a football with the intention of scoring a goal, and I foresaw that I might be successful. We dealt with the death of the cactus from overwatering, a case of foreseen but unintended consequence. However, the unforeseen and unintended is the most interesting class of unintended consequences, since we did not expect such an outcome, leading to surprise like when the cactus became sentient and spoke to George. Even the most imaginative person may not have been able to dream up such a scenario. This unforeseen and unintended class is the most powerful class of unintended consequences, since it cannot be planned for, and hence its effects may be difficult if not impossible to counter. To logically exhaust the matrix of combinations of foresight and intention, we have to examine the remaining combination of the unforeseen and intended. This combination is incoherent since to have an intention, one must have foreseen the intended outcome even if the intention is hazy, and even if the outcome finally was unintended. For example, James intended to get a reaction out of George even if he did not know what that reaction specifically would be. George gave him a punch, which was a type of reaction, hence meeting James's expectation of a reaction, though he did not know in advance it was going to hurt.